All right, let's dive into the stack of sources you shared about social media. I see you're going deep on this one, way beyond the surface level stuff.
Absolutely. And you've provided a really fascinating mix, including excerpts from Wikipedia's social media entry and a translated Turkish article titled A Short History of Social Media. So we're getting both a broad overview and a global perspective right from the start.
That's what I like to hear, a global deep dive. So where do we even begin with something as massive as social media?
Well, you might be surprised to learn that the story of social media starts way before Facebook and Twitter, even before the internet as we know it.
Really? I'm all ears. Take us back to the early days.
Picture this. It's the 1960s, and a system called Plato emerges. Now, Plato wasn't social media in the modern sense, but it had features we see everywhere today. Message forums, instant messaging, even crowdsourced online newspapers.
Wow, that's wild. It seems like those early innovators were already laying the groundwork for how we connect today.
Exactly. And it shows how deeply rooted this human desire is, to share, to debate, to form communities around shared interests. But Plato was just the beginning.
So how do we get from these early experiments in the 60s to, say, the rise of MySpace in the early 2000s?
That's where ARPANET comes in, the precursor to the internet. Well, ARPANET itself wasn't about social connection. It established the basic protocols for online communication. Think of it like this. ARPANET set the stage, and then the internet brought in the actors, the lights, and the audience.
Okay, I'm getting the picture. So once the internet arrives, what starts to take off?
Things really start buzzing with the rise of bulletin board systems, or BBSs. These were essentially localized online communities, popular in the 80s and early 90s. People would use BBSs to connect with others in their city, sharing messages, playing games, and swapping files.
So BBSs were like the original online communities before the internet became truly global.
Exactly. And as the web gained traction in the early 90s, we see the rise of blogs and forums, which started connecting people across geographic boundaries. These platforms allowed users to build communities around shared passions, whether it was music, movies, or, well, anything you can imagine.
It's fascinating how those shared interests became the threads that connected people all over the world. It's like those early online communities were shrinking the globe, one forum post at a time.
And this leads us to a pivotal moment in 1997, the launch of 6degrees.com, widely considered the first true social networking site.
6degrees.com. I vaguely remember hearing about it, but wasn't it a bit ahead of its time?
It was. What set 6degrees.com apart was its emphasis on using real names, a radical concept in the era of online anonymity. It allowed users to create profiles, connect with friends, and even browse the networks of their connections, much like we do on Facebook today.
It sounds like they were really onto something, even back then.
They were. While 6degrees.com ultimately faded, it established the blueprint for social networking as we know it. It proved that people were craving online spaces where they could connect using their real identities, fostering a different kind of online interaction. And as we'll see, this was just the tip of the iceberg.
So 6degrees.com plants the seed, but then the early 2000s are when things really explode, right?
Yeah, that's where it gets really interesting. Friendster bursts onto the scene, followed by MySpace, each with its own unique flavor, each attracting millions of users. And then Facebook enters the game, and everything changes.
It's incredible how quickly these platforms went from novelties to, well, pretty much running our lives.
Indeed. Today, we're talking billions of users worldwide, spending a significant portion of their online time on these platforms.
Which brings us to the impact. It's not just about posting selfies and sharing birthday wishes anymore, is it?
Not even close. Social media has woven itself into the fabric of our society, touching everything from politics to mental health to how we perceive ourselves.
Let's start with politics. It feels like every election cycle, social media plays a bigger and bigger role.
It's become a primary battleground for shaping narratives, mobilizing voters, and unfortunately, spreading misinformation. Remember the Arab Spring?
Oh, absolutely.
Social media was instrumental in organizing and amplifying those protests. It even played a key role in the 2008 Obama campaign, with his team using Facebook and other platforms to connect with voters and mobilize support.
Right. But then there's the flip side, the rise of fake news and these echo chambers where people only see information that reinforces their existing beliefs. And remember, the 2016 U.S. election, a lot of the focus was on Russian influence and the spread of misinformation on social media, and that's still a topic of debate.
That's a crucial point. Those algorithms we mentioned earlier, they're designed to keep you engaged. But what keeps people glued to their screens often isn't nuanced dialogue, but rather sensationalized content, outrage, and confirmation bias. The Cambridge Analytica scandal highlighted how personal data was used to target political ads, potentially influencing voters. And that's just one example of the complex relationship between social media and politics.
So it's not just about how people share information, but also about the algorithms shaping their experience and potentially the way they vote.
Absolutely. But it's not just about politics. Social media's impact on individual lives is significant, and mental health is a big part of that. We're seeing research linking heavy social media use to increased anxiety, depression, and body image issues.
You're talking about the constant comparison game, right? Seeing everyone's highlight reel can make you feel like your own life pales in comparison.
Exactly.
And studies have shown that teens who spend more time on social media are more likely to report feeling lonely and depressed.
Exactly. The pressure to present a perfect online persona, the constant barrage of curated content, it can take a toll. And it's not just about what we see. It's about how those algorithms are designed to keep us hooked. They prioritize engagement, often at the expense of genuine connection.
It's like this double-edged sword. Social media can foster connections and build communities, but it can also be a breeding ground for negativity and harmful comparisons.
Which is why it's so important to be mindful of our social media habits, to engage critically with the content we consume, and to prioritize real-world connections alongside those we cultivate online.
And maybe even take a break from those addictive algorithms every now and then.
A digital detox can do wonders, reminding us that life exists beyond the screen.
We've talked about the good and the bad, and even how those algorithms are shaping our experiences. But there's another layer to this, right? What about the potential for social media to be used for, well, less than savory purposes?
It's the dark underbelly of the digital world. Misinformation, privacy concerns, the power of deplatforming, these are serious issues we need to unpack.
Let's start with misinformation. It feels like fake news spreads like wildfire on these platforms.
It absolutely does. Studies show that false information travels faster and wider on social media than truthful content. And your sources touch on that. It preys on our emotions, exploits our biases, and spreads like a virus.
And it's not always easy to spot, right? Especially when it's disguised as legitimate news or presented in a way that seems believable.
Exactly. That's what makes it so dangerous. Remember that study from MIT that went viral a few years back? The one that found that false news stories on Twitter were 70% more likely to be retweeted than true stories. It's like our brains are wired to be drawn to the sensational, even if it's not entirely accurate.
It's like that old saying, a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes. And it feels like social media has given those lies a super highway to speed down.
It's provided the platform and the audience. And it's not just about spreading falsehoods. Think about the potential to manipulate public opinion, interfere with elections, even incite violence. The implications are huge.
Which is why it's so important to be critical consumers of information online, to verify sources, and to be wary of anything that seems too sensational to be true.
Absolutely. Media literacy is more crucial now than ever before. But even beyond the spread of misinformation, there's the whole issue of privacy, something that comes up in your Wikipedia excerpt. These platforms are collecting vast amounts of data about us. What we like, who we talk to, where we go.
It can be a bit unnerving when you stop and think about it. It's like they know us better than we know ourselves.
And that data is incredibly valuable. It's used for targeted advertising, for shaping our online experiences, and potentially even for influencing our behavior in ways we don't fully understand.
So what can we do about it? Are we just at the mercy of these data-hungry algorithms?
We're not powerless. We can adjust our privacy settings, limit the information we share, and even choose to use platforms that prioritize data privacy. There's a growing movement towards data transparency and user control, which is encouraging.
Right. And there's been a lot of talk about regulating these platforms, holding them accountable for the content they allow and how they use our data.
Exactly. The European Union, for example, has implemented the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, which gives individuals more control over their personal data. And other countries are looking at similar measures. It's a complex issue, and there's no easy solution, but the conversation is moving in the right direction.
Okay, so regulations are one piece of the puzzle, but there's another aspect we need to unpack those controversial deplatforming decisions. You know, like when Twitter banned certain high-profile individuals. Can you explain what that's all about?
Deplatforming is basically when a social media company bans a person or group from their platform, often because they violated the platform's terms of service. It's a powerful tool and a controversial one.
It sounds like a tough balancing act. On one hand, you don't want these platforms to become havens for hate speech, misinformation, or incitement to violence. But on the other hand, who gets to decide what's acceptable and what's not?
Precisely. It raises all sorts of questions about censorship, freedom of speech, and the power these companies wield. There's no easy answer, and it's a debate that will likely continue for years to come.
It feels like we're just scratching the surface of a much larger conversation here. So where do we go from here? What does the future of social media hold?
That's the million-dollar question. There's a lot of talk about decentralized, open-source social networks as an alternative to the current landscape. Imagine platforms that are owned and governed by their users, giving them more control over their data and the content they see.
So instead of these massive corporations calling the shots, it's more about individual users having a say in how these platforms operate.
Exactly. Think of it like this. If Facebook is like a shopping mall, with a company controlling everything, these decentralized platforms would be more like a collection of independent shops, each with its own rules and community. It's an intriguing concept, but it remains to be seen how it will play out in practice.
It's like the Wild West of social media, a lot of potential, a lot of unknowns, but ultimately the future of these platforms will be shaped by the choices we make as users, as creators, and as citizens.
That's a great way to put it. It's up to all of us to be informed, to engage critically, and to demand better from the platforms we use. Because in a world increasingly shaped by social media, our choices have never mattered more.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? It means staying curious, asking questions, and considering different perspectives. It means being aware of the forces at play and using that awareness to navigate the digital landscape in a way that aligns with your values. Because social media, for all its flaws and complexities, is ultimately a reflection of ourselves. It's a tool, and like any tool, it can be used for good or for ill. The choice is ours. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's been quite a journey.